Alright, legionaries, fall in. So, here's the deal. There's a lot of talk politically, there's a lot of talk geopolitically, as in relations between states, intrastate, moreover, the implications of domestic politics with international politics, still further, of course, the effect of each and the managerial class evoking its pressures within the state, the unelected body, surveillance state, all this kind of stuff, and it's all rather nebulous, right? Everyone talks about the existence of these organs, the prominence of their influence, and how sometimes they relate to actions as they occur. However, nobody explains the physics or the background of what the fuck's going on. For instance, what does power mean? What the heck does, political power necessarily entail? Obviously, it doesn't just mean people that can vote, because it also matters who can vote, and so on. Why is it that bureaucracies seem to have a lot of power and legislative bodies do not? Why is it, or how is it, that these bodies interrelate, fuse authority, legitimacy, force, and so on, and check each other, or cooperate with each other? And a lot of these questions are left unanswered. Still further, the effect of ideology with the organization of a state, or the effect of the economy with the organization of the state. The effect of the quote-unquote structure. I know that's become a dirty word, but it's important that we use it. Social structures that, galvanize certain types of life and are punitive towards others. And I'll go into the specifics between this, but I was considering this, and I was thinking about using modern examples to elucidate these concepts. However, because of the nature of, living in reality, in time, where political implications of things happen, we are also being lied to often, to say nothing, of course, of our personal biases and our emotional weakness that prevents us from seeing reality objectively. This is a major problem, and some people are able to control it more than others. However, it's extremely uncommon, and even I myself, of course, am largely biased. Everyone is. And that's not a bad thing. It's a bad thing when you're trying to unemotionally understand a concept. Okay? So, this is why, by the way, antiquity, the classical histories, are the best, especially before the Christian era. Why? Because the reality of back then was, regarding oneself and history, a lot less moralized, if that makes sense. So history was a lot less smeared with the feces of whose ever moral biases or personal vendettas and so on, with some exceptions, of course. Suetonius in Rome, or Cicero with his Philippics, it really does paint a poor picture, because this moral-centric historicity really occludes the student of history for knowing the objective truth from perceiving it, especially because most people who are writing history, unfortunately, are nerds, pencil necks, and weak people. And partially this is why I've taken on this kind of project of making these transmissions in a Homeric sense that galvanizes the manly spirits and lionizes certain impulses that are necessary to enshrine into the future, precisely because there's this underrepresentation of men and women of strong spiritual thumos, and therefore, I want to be able to craft a vision, a paradigm of the past and the present and the future from this warrior perspective. Now, there's a lot to take in, but long story short, we're going to be examining the Roman and Persian empires, their 700-year rivalry, and the evolution of the Roman state as time had gone on, and of course, providing you with an understanding of how politics, culture, and all this kind of stuff correlates with these changes and how it ends up reflecting in political history. It's a tall order, so you might want to strap in, get a little bit of whiskey in you, get a little bit loose, because I'm going to absolutely brain fuck your brain for about, a couple minutes here. So please have the patience, take the time, pause this transmission if you need to. Be aware, it will be a little bit drawn out, but we'll break this down Barney style in sections. This way you're able to gestate section by section, and finally in the analysis we'll tie it all together in a pretty little bow, from which you can do your further research, and I'll give you a provision of reading materials for your own edification should it not be sufficient. Okay? Alright, good to go. Just give me a second here. Sergeant Barnes is going to fill me up on liquor, get my dip, and we'll be right back. Alright, so we're back, right? Returning to the question of what prompted me to talk about this, well, we're focusing on an era of great power politics. However, it does not suffice to say it's great power in the sense of the 19th, 20th century, right? It's fundamentally a time where civilizational states, that is, states which represent fundamentally different civilizations, are butting up against each other. The 19th century and the 20th, which was characterized by, a number of European polities that, of course, were of different nations. However, they're part of the same civilizational sphere. Whether it's Great Britain, France, Spain, Portugal, Germany, Italy, whatever, the empires, the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Yes, there were different nations. However, they were largely part of the same oikoumene, right? They were part of the same cultural civilization. They shared the same touchstone. For instance, they shared between all of them, the experience of Rome, the classics, obviously Latin Christendom, by and large, with the exception, of course, of Greece and Russia, which experienced more of Byzantine Christendom, but still part of the same overall function, the overall OS, if that makes sense, operating system. You know how a computer has an operating system? Well, part of the same operating system. Now, conversely, the function of today, when you measure the civilizational state, as Samuel P. Huntington elucidated, it talks about how states have come to be so powerful that they encapsulate an entire civilization in a sphere. And we are butting up against, for instance, the Chinese, the PRC specifically. That polity, it has an entire civilizational sphere, a population of 1.5 billion, yes, but it's not just simply that. It's characterized by a completely different cultural sphere of experiences and a way of being in this world, right? And if you talk about Heidegger, it's just a being in of itself, a becoming of itself, which is different from what the United States is. And of course, ever since the end of World War II and the Cold War, you know, the diverging paths of Moscow and DC, and that effectively all of Europe is really an extension of the United States and the larger American culture. For better or for worse, I'm not making a value assessment about this, I'm merely stating the fact. Of course, I would say that many of us, we aim to overcome liberal American bourgeois culture, no matter where you are. However, I am stating simply what is happening. Okay, so bear that in mind, have an open mind, don't freak the fuck out. If you're gonna be fucking pissed off, just take a drink and we'll work through it. Okay. Alright, good to go. So as we continue, we often, especially you hear a bunch of this crap in American think tanks and military institutions across NATO, building a model of the world based off of Thucydides. And Thucydides, of course, is a great factor, cultural instruction manual, and he was a seminal work, defined realism. In history, he defined realpolitik, which is great, it's important. I highly recommend you read it. However, I find it lacking. Because of course it does model a lot of the things that we're going to talk in due time. However, it doesn't encapsulate, of course, the divergence in civilization. The complete and utter difference in civilizational, which is to say, psychological and organic perception of time and being. And I understand what you're saying, so who cares? Like, that doesn't matter, it's just one continuum. No. Like, when libtards say, like, there are different civilizations, there truly are, and there is not simply one monistic understanding of how one organizes or how one comes to being, what one values in the world, and of course how one politically organizes, and of course what those political goals may be. And here's the deal. In Thucydides, when he talked about the Peloponnesian War, yes, the Greek factions were very much divergent from one another, and of course they had run-ins on the periphery with the Phoenicians and the Persians. However, it was largely an inter-Hellenic struggle. And, of course, there were many social mores that were broken and that were overcome. However, it is important to understand as well that it was still taking place largely within that oikoumene, right, the Hellenic world, with all the mores and similar aspirations, and therefore it was a civil war, civilizationally. Now, this is not the same as inter-civilizational competition and rivalry, and of course warfare, alliance, whatever it may be. Now, bringing it back, what example from history do us Westerners have of facing off against a significant foe or polity or whatever that is of a different civilization, who also is capable and willing and power maximizing, but we abut each other, and that would be in remote antiquity, of course, and also to the early medieval, is the rivalry between Rome and Persia. This is a great example because, of course, written records of the Persians, whether it's simply a poverty of historical documents stemming from the Persians, or rather a poverty of translation of Persian documents and historicity into the English language, we have to understand the Persian as the other, right? And they had a total different mode of being, a total different understanding of self. They had different emphasis and political organization. They had fundamentally simply a different way of viewing life, and the implications of which, of course, still make themselves articulate even to today. The state of Iran, for instance, is still very much fundamentally different from the rest of the Middle East. And they're not a Semitic people, of course, they're an Aryan people, hence Iran, and of course the Romans are that also. However, these empires are so substantially different, and these cousins are so long lost in remote antiquity, that it kind of bears bears no resemblance or semblance in feeling with each other significantly to the extent that we're able to use this as a paradigm, as a simple way of gaming out and explaining what's happening today between us and China with what happened between Rome and Persia. Good to go? Now, before we go into the historical, we need to talk about basics. What is the purpose of this entire freaking transmission? What is the hip pocket class? Well, first of all, let's talk about power, political power, right? Power which stems from, of course, war, coercion. Now, what is power per se? When we say power, we mean a lot of things. However, it's the suite of forces, which is fundamentally psychological, but it stems from the physical, right? And especially in the political sense, what it means is, and for the record, everything that's in war is political, otherwise it's irrelevant, okay? So what is it? What is power per se? Power is the ability to either co-opt, coerce, induce, or, let's say, negate an opponent or a rival's political intent. All power is zero-sum. There's no such thing as, this economic understanding of the economy. Oh, you could just print money and it doesn't matter. Like, no. Like, there is a set amount of stuff in the world. The control over that set amount of stuff is fixed, because just like the material world, how you control the world is a fixed amount, okay? Someone's accreting power fundamentally comes at your cost, and vice versa. So with that understanding, it is a fundamentally amoral thing. It's not immoral, it's not moral, it's amoral, okay? And to prepare you mentally, stop thinking morally, okay? The graveyards of history are strewn with the bodies of lost causes and good dudes. I don't give a fuck what your aims are. I want bad boys fighting for good things, okay? Not, good little choir boys doing the good thing and then achieving nothing. Because it's more evil to lose in a cause, being a good guy, than it is to achieve a good cause at the expense of some small point of evil. Anyway, that's just my little rant, but let's get back on topic here. So there are 3 principles of governance, or power, which really kind of lay the foundation for what power is, right? First is that elite theory. It's this idea that, for instance, the top 10% of people control the rest of society. And the Pareto principle, Vilfredo Pareto, is one of the key people that we will reference in this text, in this transmission. And his idea is that you can break this down for anything. Any population sample can be filtered on a bell curve. This bell curve, of course, will be basically the top 10% tail, very small, the bottom 10%, very small, and the pack is in the middle. And that fundamentally he saw in politics, that politics of the top 10% always fundamentally reflected the characteristic of the state, which is to say the aristocracy is what controls the state of the whole. If you're in the military, you already understand this. You already know that freaking your NCO and CO have a lot more power. And of course, that is in a very specific and, formal setting. But this takes place even outside of a formal setting. Does that make sense? So this manna of political organization fundamentally always comes in the guise of this kind of distribution. Further, there's this idea of the iron rule of oligarchy. In every team, there is a leader, of course. Whether it's, he explains this as whether it's a biological or simply that's just the most efficient way of organizing. Materially, there is always the agent in the leadership, and there are people under it taking orders and acting them out. So this is not to say, of course, that being a follower is bad. In fact, it's important that there are followers and there are people that follow rules. However, it's just a matter of fact that leadership is necessary. Leaders, true leaders, are rare, and that fundamentally they always make up the minority and have the majority of power. Okay? Further, there's this idea, and this idea of iron rule of oligarchy is by Robert Michaels. I'll put a whole bunch of links below so that way you can research these topics on your own. Next one. So, this idea of, for instance, Mosca and elite theory and the circulation of elites. So what does this mean? So, okay, let's take a country, right? Any country can have the American Revolution. Boom. All right, so before the American Revolution, the elites of the colonies were fundamentally, they were contemporaries of the king and royalty. The loyalists were fundamentally royalists, right? And that was the elite. They controlled the government. They controlled a lot of the business contracts. They controlled the military, the ability to coerce. They controlled law, the legislative capacity, and so on and so forth. And they represented by their cause the royal cause, right? And then there was the revolution, the Masonic Revolution in 76, right? So there's this revolutionary clique that took power, through secession, independence, through war, established the United States, established themselves as the elite with the, obviously a different cause, with a different legitimacy. Their stating being, them representing the American nation, that was fundamentally built upon Enlightenment lines. Although it's very interesting, though, small aside, a lot of the founding fathers were not very much influenced by the thought going on in the continent. So they're not influenced by Rousseau or Voltaire, but fundamentally by Lockean and English principles. This is a small aside, but it's very interesting to note. Now, what does this mean? What do I mean by elite theory? Is that idea that in every polity there is an elite. This elite always exists, as in the meta always exists. There's always going to be an elite in a political paradigm. Anarchism, in the sense of true anarchy, as in chaos, no political organization and so on, does not have an elite because it's not an organization. But every single organization, even ones that proclaim themselves to be democratic or communistic or egalitarian or whatever, is always a lie, because fundamentally there's always, by matter of fact, an elite. And a great way of showing this principle in action is, for instance, the Soviet Union. Built upon Marxist-Leninist lines, the ideal would be, of course, once they had a world revolution down the road, that there would be no need for Soviets. There would be no need for egalitarian, leadership or autocracy or a stratification of society for organization. However, reality hits. There is, of course, a reason for continuing to fight and organize and, run society. That's just a matter of fact. So even though their myth, of course, is that they have X and Y or Z aims, they still have to fulfill, by matter of material reality, this metaphysical role that every team needs, which is to say, of course, an elite. And so there was. The elite, of course, for the Russian Revolution was Stalin and his guys of revolutionaries, and then Khrushchev and the Ukrainian kind of clique that went on there. But I'm not going to go down that route too much. But this is Mosca, right? And then, of course, finally, there's this guy Sorel and the idea of the myth. And I'm going to explain that really quickly, and I hope this makes sense. And still further, we have Sorel. Now, this idea of the popular myth. What is the popular myth, you ask? Okay, cool. Tight. So, what the popular myth is like this. It's the general philosophy that underpins the legitimacy of a state in the eyes of its citizens. So, in the United States, It's life, liberty, pursuit of happiness, and the Enlightenment goals of the founders, right? The Masonic Revolution, right? And the best example of showing how this turns over, or rather, when there are revolutions, they are propagated by new myths. So, take for instance, France. Before the Revolution of 1789, the kings ruled by the grace of God and divine mandate. And then there was the revolution, right? So the popular myth had been propagated so that it delegitimized the claim of the kings and reestablished established the ideal of rationalist Enlightenment philosophy, and therefore all forms of government came to at least have to focus or scope their actions within the political paradigm, left and right lateral limits of that ideology. And then still further, of course, there were the Neo-Jacobins, which is, by Marx, and the idea of the revolution, the proletariat revolution, and so on and so forth. Now, the popular myth is this idea that goes beyond simply an ideology. It is the legitimacy, it is the meta zeitgeist of a nation, and gives credence to the actions it takes. You know what I'm saying? So at the end of the day, if you want to be a political operative within a state, you have to at least pay homage to the myth of the state, that is the gods of the state, if that makes sense. So in the United States, no one is going to be able to run a campaign and expect to get to high office if he's unable to say, for instance, he believes in democracy and equality and life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness and all that crap. He's not going to be able to get power. However, this doesn't mean that he acts according to the myth or the vision, right? Because he can be a hypocrite. He can be subversive. In fact, many of the problems that we have today are basically people who pay lip service to get elected or to gain power, and then, of course, once they arrive in a position of power, they act to its detriment. However, there are limits to this, right? So if you basically, it gives you a cone of action. If you go too far offside the cone, it starts to be seen as corruption, or it starts to be seen as morally deplorable, and basically is subject to government censure. Now, this is important because ultimately, words matter, words mean things, ideas mean things, and meta ideas, the myths that you base your entire polity on, ultimately, they ultimately do one thing, is they also have a limit. I mean, there's a wide scope as far as actions are concerned, but they have a limit. And this myth, of course, galvanizes, tends to cause political organizations and elites, it tends to favor elites, which are most in line with the myth that that is established. Which is why, of course, in revolutions, there is a strong emphasis on the fabrication of new myths and the championing of a new paradigm, precisely because these people intend to do actions which would fall outside of the cone of ability under the current paradigm. So, for instance, let's go back to the French monarchy. Under the French monarchy, there was a whole bunch of people that had no power, but they had a lot of ability and a lot of sway, and yet there is no myth that would legitimize their actions and allow them to form a government and crystallize their power. And so what they had to do is not simply have the power that they already had. Remember, Robespierre and a lot of these dudes, Rousseau or whatever, they were lawyers. They were high middle class. They were very capable people. But they didn't have the legitimacy. And so a lot of the Enlightenment, especially in political thought and philosophy, sought to articulate and build and legitimize the rule of or the being of a life which would allow their power to be expressed. Okay, so this is why words and myths mean things. Again, this is the Sorel myth, George Sorel. You might want to look that up too. It's very interesting. But ideas catalyze action. And this is true no matter what you do. I mean, ideas are very important. There are abstract ideals of philosophy, the nomos in the Greek, right? And then there's, of course, physis, or rather nature. All of us are biological beings. I hope you're not retarded and believe that you're like 100% agency. Just like Charon of ancient Greece, there's this idea that to be a higher man, one must reconcile his nature with his higher being. And there will always be nature, our beast self. And of course, everything that entails. The biological imperatives and natural instincts that organic beings have, specifically us, hominids, primates, mammals, who care for things, concepts that transcend simply valuations of the nomos. Like, okay, what do I mean? All right, tight. So, of course, unless you're like mentally ill or fucked up or have something wrong with you, you care about your family. You don't want your family getting killed. You want what's best for them. You want what's best for your son and daughter. You want what's best for your wife and all that stuff. That's fundamentally biological and a universal principle. Further, that lends to patriotism. The meta clan, if that makes sense, the meta family, biological relation between meta groups. This too is another biological imperative that we still see even in countries whose ideologies ostensibly do away with this thing. So the Soviet Union wanted to destroy the family and wanted to destroy the nation and make a workers' paradise, right? So it had to abolish these things. But it flew in the face, and they ultimately just caved into this reality that people were fundamentally national. People were fundamentally cared about family because that is a natural association, which is immutable. I mean, unless, of course, we at some point are bred genetically into another species of being or something, that doesn't come naturally to us. But that's really kind of like impossible and extremely difficult and unlikely. Fundamentally, we should just take it as a granted that humans want to associate in natural associations, primarily the function of the family writ large. Further, the imperatives of food and water and natural psychological needs of association, of sex, for instance, access to it. Further, other kind of aspects that we take for granted in our biological life have very strong currents of effect in the larger political realm, especially on the community level, but even on the meta community, even the national level. And all of these things usually are post hoc rationalizations of securing the interests of these core biological needs that need to be met. And of course, part of them is getting those political ends to marry up to those means, right? Or needs, excuse me, not means. And so, that is the crux of the political, right? We've already set the foundation. So, I've already explained to you, amongst humans, there's a stratified continuum up and down, like a pyramid, right? A pyramid of Giza, of ability, groups that are teams, that have associations, always associate, and therefore there will always be ruled and rulers. So rulers and ruled. That's Mosca, right? And then, of course, all of these associations are predicated on legitimacy, which is made by a myth, Sorel, George Sorel. Okay? And then further, considerations of elites. There will always be an elite. There will always be ruled and ruled, like I said. There's always that Pareto principle of ability. And there's, of course, the biological imperatives of life, which intercede in the associations of man and take form in the political realm. Okay? So that's the foundation. But what does that mean practically? And we can see that and use this paradigm to look at the evolution of states like Rome over time, especially because there's such a great, tradition of literacy and record keeping that gives us the paper trail that we need to show you those changes. And of course, it removes us, because of the distance between us and Rome, from an emotional bias that keeps us more objective and understanding of how things continue. Now, to kind of shoot myself in the foot here, I love Rome, and if you say anything bad, not only will I personally assault you, you probably go to hell. Now, no, in all seriousness though, Rome is this formative and foundational myth, experience of the wider Western world and world history that gives us a number of different inspirations, as well as lessons, wisdom, and so on by its mere existence, specifically in the political realm. Why? Well, Rome transcended past beyond its early Hellenic city-state model that it had been founded. Of course, if you extend that back to the mythic past in the 700 BC, up into the Bronze Age and all that kind of good stuff, and Etruscans and all those good guys and stuff like that. Well, we can watch as it evolved. First, it was a kingdom under Romulus, emerging from the mists of antiquity, bathed in the origins of the great Aeneid, Aeneas being the historic mythic founder of the progenitor of Rome, right? Romulus and all that good stuff, who escaped Troy with his father and the sword of Troy. And this is the, obviously, tie-in of the wider Latin world with the ancient Hellenes. And small comment, the Hellenic oikoumene, the civilization, was distinct and different. However, it was also relevant and familiar to the Latins, enough so that these people eventually formed a synthesis later on in the Roman Empire, where they became effectively inseparable in the late Roman Empire, of course. Now, Rome evolved past its kingdom phase into the early republic. Finally, it grew powerful by force of arms and valor, and a number of its different virtues that it explored. And of course, when I say virtue in the context always of Lance's Legion, it's always the Machiavellian virtù, in the sense of courage and manly fortitude and honor and all that kind of stuff. And it has nothing to do with Christian virtues of being a little choir boy, okay? So bear that in mind. And then further, of course, then we go into the early imperial age of the Principate, followed by the Dominate, and ultimately the Christian era, which characterized Constantine all the way through to 1453 and the fall of Constantinople. All of these distinctions and changes, rather, in the larger polity and expressions of culture within gives us an understanding of how the political realm changed and foisted itself and expressed itself differently. And of course, I'm going to get to the rivalry between Rome and Persia later, but just bear with me here, okay? So, in the early republic, because the kingdom is far too remote from us to actually understand what actually happened. If we were able to understand what life was in the kingdom of Rome, when it was, one king and ruled Rome, as a autocrat himself, he did so much on the same model as the ancient Hellenes, for instance, the tyrant of Syracuse and so on, who was able to, but it's too much of a backwater. Here's the thing, is that, Rome in this era before the early republic was just so remote and in the periphery of civilization that it doesn't it's not worth mentioning because of the fact that, of course, it was just really just a podunk town on the side of the freaking highway on the way to Etruria, where they're like actual civilization with a network of different client kings and all ruled from Etruria and all that kind of good stuff, Tuscany. So I won't waste my time. Now, the early republic. What is the early republic? So when they overthrew the kings, why did they overthrow the kings? They felt that the kings were becoming especially tyrannical. And in the context of the ancient world, this often meant not just, of course, depredations of finance and assassination, but namely enjoying the wives of your subordinates and of your subjects. This is one thing that Machiavelli harps on: never to bang someone's wife, cheat on your wife especially, or do anything of that nature. I think it's just extremely wise, no matter whether or not you feel any affection for your spouse or the spouse of another or whatever. Keep your fucking dick in your pants, except for the right fucking reasons. Okay? It literally will cause a fucking revolution. And this is a recurring theme too, by the way. One of the reasons why the French Revolution happened was namely because of the profligacy of the French kings. And it estranged many of the lower and upper nobles into allying with this emerging faction of liberal Enlightenment figures. So again, do not destabilize your kingdom. However, going on, there was this elite, right? This elite ruling class, who were called the patricians, and they were formed, of course, by the original families who founded Rome. By this time, it wasn't simply the patricians who formed the optimates, of course, the ruling class. There were, of course, parvenus, who were plebeians, and yet were part of the optimate class that formed the Republic. However, the early Republic was exceptionally walled off to any parvenu-type individuals. Everyone saw that the city of Rome and its governance fell to the duty and the prerogative of the families who originally constituted it. As time went on and the power of the Roman Republic augmented in the form of military dominance in the region, as well as economic dominance, and in the ancient times this meant slavery and the accumulation of slaves and lower freedmen, the function of the Republic also came to have new elites. These were called the equites. The equites were simply what we call rich people now today. The issue with America is that if you're truly wealthy, and I don't mean to say like wealthy, like billionaire wealthy or decabillionaire. I mean truly, actually wealthy. Your wealth is so well hidden and diffuse because you have that power that you're not even mentioned, and that's the issue. But then there is this group, like for instance Elon Musk and whatever, the guy Jeff Bezos or whatever. Both of these people are rich. However, they're not powerful. They're not powerful precisely because we know everything about them. Power is being able to leverage wealth and obfuscate the extent of it. So these people are what in ancient Rome would be called equites. They were extremely powerful in the sense they had a lot of wealth, but that was it. The patricians had old money. They were established. They were legitimate. And of course, they had a lot of martial prowess, which in the times of the Republic, you have to remember that the military model was fundamentally a citizen body under arms. Everyone, to be a citizen, to engage in the Republic, ultimately had to pay a sort of fee, or rather, the correct term is civic duty, of arming oneself in the call of the Legion when war was declared. People who were actually wealthy were able to equip themselves as cavalry, hence equites, which is the Latin for cavalrymen, right? And so they were able to not simply buy good armor, good weapons, and so on, but they were also able to fodder their horse, to train on horseback. They were basically wealthy enough to be fully trained warriors able to delegate their everyday means to their estate. So their wife ran a household slave, their households held a plantation, or had a way of making income. That income, of course, was passive and always was kicked up to the paterfamilias, who focused his emphasis in the Roman Republic on political, accumulation of power. That is the ultimate pinnacle of, a Roman citizen's, let's say, ambition. The ambition to become, preeminent amongst men. Further, of course, you have to remember that the Roman society, it was governed on the principle of the patron-client system, which is different, if you remember, from the Hellenic era, or the Hellenic civilization, which was very much a focus on peerage. The Latins were a lot more hierarchical and, autocratic in this principle. There was very much an up and down chain as opposed to side to side. There was this feeling, of course, built off of the ideal of the paterfamilias and the patriarchy, in the sense of a patriarchal family, which is really any family, but it always centered on the father of the family being the head of the household, who had the power of life and death legally over the members of his household. And everything, the individual was fundamentally constituted on this basis. So when you had a clientage, what happened was you had this chain of a patron who gave favors, protection, support to a client who kicked up, honors and support, etc., to these individuals. And so what would happen was there was this interrelationship, and of course every client and patron had a family, and therefore their power kind of was basically a long rope of beads of power. The ideal was that you became powerful and wealthy enough and leveraged your network, so that way you could constantly climb up this thing called the cursus honorum. The cursus honorum was this well set out constitutional, not simply habit of seeking political office, but it was a continuum. It was a legalistic, how do you say this, checkbox that you had to, hit those wickets on the way to the preeminence of power. And the prominence of power is the consulship. And ultimately, the peerage between clans, or as they would call it, gens in the Latin world, is this idea that the more political offices your ancestors held, especially the consul, which in the Republican era, the Republic every year elected 2 consuls as co-consuls, and the concept was they have 2, so that way, if war were to be declared, one would stay and rule at home while the other took the field. Obviously, it doesn't really make for great leadership. As you know, unity of command does not stand 2 leaders. That doesn't work. But anyway, long story short, the more consuls or ancestors who held high political office in your past that you could leverage, the higher in prominence your family was in the greater Respublica, right? This is where we get the word republic, and the words of that, all that kind of good stuff. So we get this very much of a feeling of a ruling class that was drawn from these patricians who were wealthy, who fundamentally based their power on not just personal excellence, but martial and economic excellence, as well as political influence and social influence. So they leveraged the human aspect, so the patron-client system. They leveraged their martial career, so their ability to raise legions, lead them in battle, lead men, and so on. And then, of course, leverage these 2 factors and their wealth, of course, to gain high political prominence. And remember, in this time in the Roman era, there was no delineation between the martial duties of a politician and his bureaucratic ones. Everything was kind of rolled up in one. If you were a Roman politician, you were responsible for both the safety and the well-running of the bureaucracy of your region or your province or whatever it may be. And so this ruling class, to bring it back to Mosca, right? Like this idea that there's ruled and the rulers. The rulers were fundamentally those military aristocracy men, right? The equites, the guys that actually not simply whose whole life was warfare because they had already extended their capabilities beyond simply having to dedicate their entire lives to wealth accumulation, right? They don't have to worry about working because they've already set up enough wealth and active wealth that can support their follow-on duties, right? And this is where Benjamin Franklin gets the concept that he believes that, elected officials, they shouldn't get a salary because this was a way of selecting against people who were doing so to seek venal office. In other words, people who were seeking office to get rich themselves, because as you'll see in the late Republic, this patrician class ultimately sought political power to aggrandize themselves fiscally, and of course to the detriment of the larger res publica. That came at the cost of the citizen class. It came at their own cost as well, because they would ultimately be litigated, at the cost of the legitimacy of the Senate, because ultimately corruption was rampant, and the accumulation of wealth was so great that ultimately they were able to bribe themselves out of corruption that they had done abroad when they came back from their term of service beyond, and therefore the rule of law was eroded, the stability of the state was eroded, the concentration of wealth became concentrated, the fruits of the labors and well-being of the general public was sold out for the interests of the few, and there was no, it was increasingly difficult to, how do you say this? It was increasingly difficult for the citizen body at large to engage meaningfully in the way it had in the early Republic. Because remember, in the early Republic, where it was just a city-state, okay, and then a couple other towns over the hill, yeah, you could probably be a small dude, not very well off, not very bright or whatever, but hey, if something bad happened, you could hold your hires and your betters to account, ultimately in the form of a mob, or whatever it may be. You can, take a shit, put it, make a snowball out of it and throw it at him at the Senate Hall. This happened a lot for a lot of corrupt people. So ultimately, discipline and integrity was insisted because there was this, not simply check. It wasn't a check, because check implies there was this stifling effect. No. It kept each other honest, right? Both ways. Because obviously in the field, and especially that early Republic, which was incredibly martial, you had the hires had the power of life and death over the simple plebs, and could make exigencies of the citizen body to be physically fit and prepared for war. And we're basically always, the citizen was always fundamentally a martial principle, and not what we think today as someone who was shit out somewhere and they have a piece of paper or whatever, something very strange. No. It came with duties and responsibilities and pools, and of course, this patron-client situation. And so, as the Republic grew in size and wealth, it started taking over vast swaths of the Mediterranean basin. It started subordinating rival kingdoms, empires, principalities, and republics, who all fell sway to the power of Rome. But here's the deal. All the money that came to the patricians, even though, of course, they did their due diligence that had become a norm, which is to basically kick back that wealth by throwing public games at their own expense, by giving free food away at their own expense as a way, and the reciprocity of this mechanism was of course a way of getting elected again. But they became so grossly wealthy that they no longer needed the labor of locals because they had tons of slaves. They bought up all the land, and what ended up happening is you had this entrenched patrician class with all the wealth, all the money, all the power, and then they gave nothing back, nothing meaningful, and no opportunities, of course, for their clients, for the poor, who were Romans, to have a good, decent life. And most people can't be fucking rich. Most people are content with being, whatever, middle class, and that's more okay. But the thing is, under their poor leadership in the late Republic, the middle class became the lower class. They became effectively so poor and impoverished and shut out of power and wealth that they were starving. And a lot of bad things started happening, and hence the revolution of the Gracchi. Now, that's a lot to take in, but to suffice it to say, the Gracchi, who are the Gracchi? They were this populist faction, the Populares versus the Optimates, right? And they represented the interests of the people. Whether it was Machiavellian in the low sense or it was out of good intentions of the Republic, you have to remember that this was the time where militias of the Legion was originally a militia, right? So it wasn't a standing army. And as time went on and the power of Rome grew, there was this need for a standing army. And so that changes the dynamic of power, right? Because the only people who had the power of raising and leading troops in the field were the senators. And as time went on, their power grew. However, the terms of service for military service grew longer and longer. It used to be that you'd get called up for service for 1 year max, and there'd be times of peace, or there'd just be campaigning seasons. So basically from March to October, so that way they could come back and farm their fields. However, as Rome came into the late Republican era, men were called away from their farms and from their cities for long periods of time, almost a decade. And this ended up indicating the need for a standing army, right? This is what happened with the Marian reforms and the formation of true legionaries. Legionaries being full-time military members. It used to be that in the early Republic only the Optimates had that power. Now, the standing military, who were not necessarily part of the patrician class, wielded a lot of power themselves, and who, of course, were drawn from the plebeian factions, and who, of course, were their champions. And so the dynamic of power within the Roman state changed, functionally. And the expressions of this during the Republican Revolution also grew into account. So what happened was the Populares were trying to rein in the patricians and to make the case for their constituents, who were the regular middle class and lower class, to give grain, a minimum grain, so like UBI basically, and then of course, a minimum labor. So basically, senators were required to hire a certain percentage of their workforce from the local Roman population, because what was happening is like slave labor is free labor, right? And so what happens is that's far more economically efficient than paying some dude, right? So basically, it was throwing the labor markets out of whack. This is why, of course, our elites want immigrants, so that way they can drive down the price of labor costs, to a very, very small percentage of what it should be. And so it impoverishes the rest of the country at their expense, and for the wealth of a very small elite who are selfish and, forget immoral, but like they're just basically the reason why the Republic is unraveling. because they don't rule for the general good. They rule for their own petty ambition. And of course, this petty ambition is not like, Augustus or the late emperors who want to carve their names and better the Roman Empire. It's petty licentiousness and avarice, like you see today. Like Jeff Bezos. What does he do with his wealth? He's stuck at Hollywood, slamming pretty mid-poon and deferring to their opinions. It's very boring kind of dude. He has no big plans. He doesn't do things like Elon Musk, like going to the stars and stuff like that. Think of that as from the patricians. The patricians are precisely these kinds of people. They're pathetic and selfish in a petty way. You know what I mean? And so, of course, there's a period of civil wars because between the Optimates and the Populares, it goes back and forth. First, the Gracchi brothers get murdered by the senators, but that doesn't stop or address the underlying problems, because the senators and the patricians were derelict in their duties to the people, right? And this rancor caused people to support the military and Marius, who in turn, led a revolution, and then there was civil war, and then Sulla came back and restored the old Roman Empire or Roman Republic, and so there's this back and forth, right? And the issue, though, is that still the underpinning issues remained and remained unaddressed, which is the patricians were petty, licentious, effeminate individuals who were destroying the republic for their own personal gain and destroying any representation officially. But then, of course, it doesn't matter if you recognize them officially. It invites revolution, which came in the form of Caesar, Pompey Magnus, and it was Crassus formed the first triumvirate. Now, these men were not merely rich; they were powerful in the relations they had with their peers and their subordinates in the patron-client system, in addition to being personally excellent and men of action and ability. And they had personal convictions to help the Popularist faction, so the Caesar's faction, so on and like that. And what ended up happening was, they became far more powerful and more rich than the Optimate class because they allied themselves with the Populares. And in fact, Caesar narrowly, when he was 14, escaped assassination by Sulla, who was a counter-revolutionary. So as you can see, the dynamic is always predicated on a metapolitical arena and dynamic that goes beyond the official organs of government, right? Politics is always reality, and whether or not you realize it officially, it is irrelevant to how it expresses itself. If you're not able to, first of all, if your system is not a good system, if it doesn't, give sufficient benefits to those below you or to the constituents, and you basically stonewall any kind of recruitment from the ranks into the aristocracy of your country, you invite revolution, violent revolution. And the Soviet Union and the Soviet Revolution, the Communist Revolution of Russia, was precisely because of this. Like, for instance, the Russian Tsar and the autocratic principle refused to do reforms, and when he did, they were lackluster, not sufficient, not enough to sate the thirst or needs of the people, and so a lot of demagogues played up and took advantage of that. And even in 1905, same thing. It just simply wasn't sufficient. Alright, so, Legionaries. I'm gonna, speed run the rest of Roman history, because this shit is really, really long, and I want to make sure that we kind of retain our focus on the correct paradigm here, which is applying our political understanding of the world practically. into history, right? Okay, so anyway, returning to the fucking beat of the drum here. So the Civil War happens. Caesar is triumphant, becomes dictator, gets whacked. Okay, cool, tight. However, the political structure, the gravity of the structure remains the same, right? So ultimately it becomes the case that the necessity of a dictator or an autocratic figure who is popular, who is who function as a balancer of interest between the nobles, right, and the plebeians and the general populace, and also, of course, of the military establishment. So, in the early republic, remember, there was one establishment, and that was the patrician class, who basically had in tow the plebeians. Okay, so one establishment, and then as time went on, two establishments were made felt: the patricians and the populares, who were the plebeians, right? And of course, any patrician families who felt to be part of that cause. And then, as time went on, the interests of the entrenched military, the people who are lifelong professional military members. All three started to have a political influence. The patrician, who held the power of legitimate government, who were the how do you say, the nexus of legitimacy, who were the underpinnings of the republic, who ran the republic, who elected individuals, who, you know, made the state function itself. So they were also bureaucrats, doubled as bureaucrats, and, you know, all that kind of good stuff, as well as high officer class of the military. Then further, the plebeians, who they of course had power in the Senate in the form of tribunes, which became curtailed after Sulla. However, they also had interests in how they expelled or expressed political power, and they could do that by electing or unelecting magistrates and senators and so on. And they had some, you know, pull that way. And then further still, the military, which obviously was drawn from majority of the plebeian class, and of course the officers who were most likely to be populares, right? Because they wanted the republic to function. They weren't petty or licentious people. They understood something needed to be changed, and that leadership ran down the chain of command, not simply up. And you didn't rule simply to aggrandize or enrich yourself. You did it so that way your country or your homeland, everyone within it, was your responsibility, and you wanted their success. And so there was this establishment of the military being an effectual force. Okay, 2 rounds of civil wars happen. First, Caesar, the first triumvirate, all that kind of stuff. Like I said, Caesar ended up crushing the other 2 triumvirs, gets whacked by the reactionaries in government who are resentful of this dictatorship type of meta position that was invented and necessitated. Like I said, it was a Caesarist function in government that balanced the interests of the patricians and the plebeians in the name of the greater good. They are subsequently destroyed by the second triumvirate, who is then, of course, the other 2. The second triumvirate constituted of Octavian, later Augustus Caesar, Mark Antony, and Lepidus. Lepidus is the first one offed, and he's set into retirement until his death on some random island in the middle of the Mediterranean. Mark Antony is famously defeated and pushed to suicide, and Cleopatra obviously commits suicide, his close agent, and Augustus Caesar is left king of the hill, or should I say princeps, imperator. However, he's wise. He appeals to the myth. Remember what I was talking about, the myth of Sorel, of the Roman Republic. Rome being a republic, not a kingdom, not an Eastern despotate, not some crazy, absolute autocracy, or at least the dressing, let's say, how one portrayed himself. He always portrayed himself as princeps, Latin for a first citizen, which had, of course, a titular precedence in the Republic, because every consul was normally referred to as the princeps consulares, right? And so he played up the myth of the Republic, and how he was the restorer of the Republic, and how he never sought any honors or titles that was a break from the past. He always leveraged the tradition of the Republic, of the Roman Republic, and weaved that into something new. Everyone who actually knew what was up understood it. However, he didn't do this massive mistake that Caesar did of calling himself dictator in perpetuum. An unprecedented, basically, office. An office which had been legislated away, and then under his auspices re-legislated, and then, given untold, extensions beyond simply its 6-month imperative, how historically it was supposed to have been. So it was basically wise how the revolution happened, but Augustus changed Rome for good. It realized the political dynamic of what the Republic had become, which is an empire run by the military, legitimized partially by the patricians still. They still had an air of legitimacy, and things had to be laundered or rubber stamped through the Senate. And, of course, the majority of their political support came from the plebeians. So they were very much populists, right? Because that was the political dynamic of the time. Now, as time goes on and Rome expands in the Principate, the military becomes ever more powerful. The engagement of the citizens at Rome, the plebeians, becomes a lot more muted and a lot more simple to address. So long as there is, grain, games, bread and circuses, they would do whatever. They don't give a fuck. You know what I mean? This is like in Brazil. So long as there's ass and samba and soccer, they're happy. In America, it's football Sundays and burgers. That's okay too. And so the lower classes are always easily bought off, especially if there's labor and stuff like that. If you focus on their very base and very simple needs. So their political influence drops away, especially when the empire becomes so rich that becomes a non-factor, right? And then later, of course, as time goes on, the senatorial class becomes weaker and weaker and weaker, until finally they are relegated to basically what the monarch of England is today. A figurehead, a nexus of tradition, a kind of constitution, a locus of self-identity, but everybody knows they have no real power. They are all birds in cages with clipped wings at the beck and call of the emperor. Of course, they have some little bit of panache in them, well into the 200s, by, plots and murders and all this stuff, but fundamentally, all the way since Caesar and Augustus Caesar, the advent of the emperor office, the office of the emperor, was never negated. The Republic could never return, principally because it had revealed to the state its metapolitical need. It fulfilled a need that was necessary. And so they filled it. And so it was impossible to kind of go back. A strong executive became necessary, especially in the face of a venal patrician elite caste. Okay? And then, of course, over time, the number of families who officially were part of the patriciate started dying off. By the time Constantine the Great had become emperor, there was like one or two families who could draw their lineage from the origins of the Republic. All these people started dying off in the various civil wars that existed. And so the way that people became senators was through the army or through favor of the emperor. And so, as you can see, there was no political imperative. There was no nexus of political legitimacy coming from the Senate anymore. It was just kind of this spandrel, hangers-on type organ of government that just simply had been part of Rome since the beginning, right? Or at least since the early Republic. And then, finally, mask-off moment. It's the dominate. This is the transition from the imperial era, which still sought legitimacy from a consul, from a senate, and so on, to the centrality of the emperor as everything, who was fundamentally got his legitimacy from the army. This was so true that there was this era of Rome, which was called the Barracks Emperors, the Barrack Emperors fucking era, Caracalla and all them. And Domitian and Aurelian, and then later, of course, finally with Diocletian. All their legitimacy came from having reached office by the military, by coercion, and by the support of the legions, because everything else didn't matter. Ultimately, Rome didn't matter politically. The empire became so wide that the citizen body didn't matter. The citizen body didn't care about the republic so long as that they had money in their hands, food in their mouths, and some relative measure of safety and law and order, right? So basically they had no effect on what was happening. And then finally, they become called dominos, hence the term the dominate. And this idea is that it transitioned from princeps, so a first citizen of the emperor of the imperial era, or the principate era, to dominos. This is a term that slaves used for the heads of households. It was one of total subjection and a monarchy in practice and in theory, right? And that's what exactly it became. The Roman Republic finally metamorphosized into a monarchy headed by an emperor who is an autocrat who got his legitimacy from the military, and everything else kind of fell away. This is how ultimately the Roman Empire died, even into the Byzantine era. After the Christians came to power, the legitimacy fell to the monarch, and it fell to, in large part, the Christian Church later, but always under the sway of the monarch and his bureaucracy and his military, and that's it. And so, as you can see, it's not this static thing. It's this evolving organism, meta-organism, meta-political organism, and different necessities of state and political outcomes, change with the times. However, I think it's important that we don't make the mistake most historians do, which is to reflect on the past and claim it to be fated. In other words, to say, oh, it was always going to end up this way, because I don't believe that. Take, for instance, the first revolution, the first Roman revolution, and the need for a dictator or whatever, like the need for a strong man. The patrician class could have easily outmaneuvered the populares by simply being good dudes, They could have made sure that the Roman citizen body were getting everything they wanted: labor, food, entertainment, whatever it may be, rise to their occasion, be less rapacious, be legitimate, be honest, rule the Roman Republic for the good of Rome, not for their purses, not for their wives, not for themselves, not for their fucking own careers, not for their selfish avarice, but if they had been good leaders and they had served their people, the Roman Republic ostensibly, conceptually, hypothetically, could have continued all the way until 1453 or beyond, right? So let's just say that. It doesn't... The differing political dynamics of things occurring, yes, it can affect and gravitate towards one solution or the other. However, humans are endowed with agency, and great human beings, great men and women, they're given more agency than most. And anyone who has a will has a way. And so ultimately, the way I think of it is that ultimately the patricians were fundamentally corrupt, and they fell away and ceded their power to the army and later the plebeians, who were abandoned, and the army who was ascended. Now, if some of you boys and girls are exceptionally bright, you probably would have picked up on the fact that these changes ultimately emulated the changes in who held the spout or the origin of what power is. That is coercion, right? Physical force. But also soft power. Now, the delineation between hard and soft power is this. Hard power is, laws, fucking handing out judgments, killing people, force of arms, military shit, stuff like that. Soft power is cultural. It's shaping opinion. It's newspapers and academics and, even bands that make music. People that can sway opinion and shape the psychological landscape of a person's mental horizons. Does that make sense? So, ultimately, in the Roman Republic, the Senate ceded more and more of this coercive power to another organ, which became the standing legion, right? And they became more and more irrelevant because of their poor leadership, A, and B, because of their inability to reconcile structural changes in the reality of the political landscape, which is, of course, the beginnings of this standing military, which itself was a nexus of power. And they formed no ways to either check or to make sure that that institution remained under their power, or they just dropped the ball on that, okay? And there's this common understanding of politics as convictions which revolve around debating which means of governance are the best. Cast this away from your mind right now. Right now. And remember, just like, for instance, if you do a tactic and it's stupid but it works, it ain't stupid. Well, different times and situations call for different types of organization. Sometimes it's necessary to have autocratic leadership. Quite other times, it's important to have libertine leadership, or rather, ones that have a wide scope and are laissez-faire. What is the distinguish? Livy talks about Rome, and Machiavelli talks about Rome, because it was this perfect mesh of all the elements of governments, all the types of leadership that gave way to flourishing and excellence of the citizen body. When when situations politically, economically, socially made it obvious for it to pivot or change and evolve, it adapted and overcame, as we saw in its various iterations, right? It's a mistake to be wedded to one type of form. We have to be, the only thing we should be steadfast with is our ends. What are our ends? What did Rome seek to do? Romans, fundamentally, they were all animated by the will to domination. Nietzsche says that the Greeks were animated by this moray of seeking to excel all others. Well, I think the Romans had something very close to that corollary, which is seek to domination, because it wasn't simply a system of peerage, right, and agon. It was this idea of patron-client, and it was this concept of universal mandate to everything. The Aeneid and all that good stuff. It was all a function of this more dermal, spiritual constitution that is what it meant to be Roman. And it was fleshed out in every way that it focused, in its focuses, in its social organization, in its myths and legends, in its culture and all that kind of stuff, okay? Now, why do I want to say this? I'm saying this because ultimately people forget, they miss the forest for the trees, okay? And what I mean by that is people really kind of harp on one system or another being best. I myself fall into my certain prejudices. However, it's important that we remain objective. And remember that Rome was great precisely because there was this mixture of institutions and principles. There was good functioning, right? Because in the ruler-ruled situation, it was always the case that once the rulers became rapacious and ossified, and they didn't allow, once they became too exclusive, not allowing the general body politic to recruit into its ranks certain new elites, right? So there's no circulation in elite and rulership. There's no checks or balances in the sense of making sure that they were doing the right thing. Rome had this capacity to do evolutions, to kind of like water, seek out ways to overcome shortcomings. And the reason why, after the Principate, Rome fell into this abject autocracy that caused the death of an empire, that caused basically the economic ruin of an empire, of the general body politic of the citizenry to fail to make good culture, great culture, to make even great human specimens. For instance, the standards of military servicemen who were selected for volunteer service in the legions fell dramatically. Height, nutrition for every legionary and every citizen was significantly curtailed, so that way their antecedents were far stronger, smarter, more developed than they were during the era of the Dominate. Now, that should be indicating to you the shortcomings of that autocracy, precisely under the tripartite system of the tetrarchy, right? So these are the challenges that we have to understand. And when we're looking into the world, we have to ask ourselves, does this organization and this way of organizing society or the republic or whatever the fuck you want to call it, is it leading to good consequences? Ultimately, for its time, the republic was great, until finally it became corrupt and it needed to evolve. In its evolution and its Augustan period for 200 years, it was relatively stable. It brought untold peace and prosperity to the various provinces. It Romanized the world and expanded the horizons of culture for many millions of people. And this is when really Rome came into its full power, precisely because though the Senate had been relegated to a subordinate level, it still had enough potency that it could not be written off. It provided an elite that were part of the bureaucratic state that could run Rome well and to legislate for it in the minor matters, of course, and provided, the elite people a reason to become rich, powerful, to give back to the Republic. But then, of course, their rapaciousness their rapacity and their lower instincts were curtailed and balanced by the emperor, who kept them in check, who then, of course, looked after the people, and vice versa. As time went on, this deteriorated into the dominate, because the Senate no longer meant anything. You could kill them, you make the whole sham, nobody cares. The the plebeians, it didn't matter because the Senate failed, because there was no reason to go back to Rome. The plebeians of Rome no longer mattered as well, and so the only people who mattered are those who could command legions, and therefore legions became the locus of legitimacy. It became Rome itself. So it's interesting, as you kind of go on, you understand how the structure of a political environment really shapes the expression of the body politic. And I kind of understand that this almost impels my arguments against the means being an ends in itself. Because if it were the case that the army was checked by the plebs in Rome and have re-centralized the empire into the Roman city, there would be more reason, right, for there to be checks and balances, and less excesses of autocracy, which would later characterize the era of the dominate. So it's a tricky question, and it's one that is partially chance and partially agency. And I believe that, it is true that fortune plays a massive role, at least 50%, but if there are men and women motivated to do the right thing, whether or not they personally benefit from its championing its cause, we are able to form systems and structures which are to the benefit of the greater good, right, to our Rome. And it's impressive that Rome lasts this long, right? Because it wasn't simply that Rome lasted long because it had a good constitution and a good structure, but it also inspired citizens and people with agency, men, who loved her and wanted to see it work. Because here's the other end of this argument. So it's not just agency, but structuralism that matters. But a structure doesn't mean anything if you're not exuding agency, if you're not bought into its success. And Rome had this way of making people fall in love with her and wanting her to succeed, wanting to rule for the benefit of Rome herself. And I think that's something that we lose, is because everyone hates America. Whether it's the people that are resentful due to heritage Americans, for instance, who are resented because they're resentful because they're basically passed up, kind of like in the late Republic, where the plebeians of Rome were passed up for the patricians and their personal avarice, or basically foreigners or people subversives that hate America for America itself. No one loves her, except for me and my friends, of course. And it doesn't matter what constitution you may have. No team will last long enough if you don't have the first element of success, which is that ardor and determination and will to see things succeed. I mean, this is just basic leadership writ large, right? Extreme ownership and all that good stuff. Now, reflecting on the wider aspects, you can see how structures incentivize new elites to form, the necessity of allowing elites to become part of the, or rather, for newcomers to the elite class, for a transition in power and sharing of it, and the necessity of a certain level of flexibility requisite to see the wider body politic succeed. Now, let me give you some antipodal evidence, or maybe some anecdotal evidence that shows how structure affects organization and political life and cultural life. Okay? So in Sparta, for instance, hardly an autocracy, but it was deeply conservative in the sense that, for those of you who don't know how Sparta was organized, it was like basically this warrior caste who was at the top. They were called the Spartiates. The next caste, which were called the Perioikoi, who were called basically men who were free, who lived under the rule of the Spartans, who would sometimes give military service. However, they weren't slaves and objects of the state. They had a certain, basically, level of autonomy. So how does this make sense? The way that you should frame it is basically the Perioikoi were nominally part of the wider society, but because of their relegated state, they were also not its most foremost champions. They had no real reason to pull too hard for the Spartans. They had no reason to hate the Spartans. And finally, the bottom case, the Helots, who were previously the Massalians, who had been the original inhabitants of the area called Laconia, right? And of course, they had every reason to hate the Spartans, who had basically relegated their entire nation to abject slavery. Okay? Now, what does this mean? What happened was the autocratic nature of the Spartans that fossilized and prevented new elites from rising up from the citizen body or the general body politic caused a number of issues. One was manpower. So, over time, the citizen pool of Spartiates shrunk to the point where they weren't able to project military power, political power enough, because there just wasn't enough people. There weren't enough bodies, Second, they were so conservative about maintaining the constitution of Lycurgus that even after the Peloponnesian War, where the Perioikoi had been pressed into service when they originally would not have been, they weren't allowed to become part of the Spartiate. So, basically, they had no political power, and so they were forced to go abroad. They were forced to go out and to find colonies in, for instance, Magna Graecia in southern Italy, cities like Taras, which is a famous Dorian city-state, or Melos, and so on. Why is this significant? Well, it should show you that, yes, Sparta has many, laudable traits, great citizen body, with an emphasis on training up its citizen body to being moral and virtuous, strong, virile men and women who upheld their state and were utmost patriots. However, the downside was they weren't flexible enough to deal with the times. And by the time that Macedon had become ascended and conquered the rest of the Hellenic world, they could only just sit there and get freaking rolled, right? If it weren't for the fact that Philip II had extended a certain guarantee or a kind of, how do you say this? He did a gentleman's agreement with Sparta because he admired them so much that he didn't want to crush it. He didn't want to be responsible for that. And so he let them live on until finally, of course, the Romans just crushed everyone after that. You don't want to be at the mercy of someone. And Moreover, the way their society was structured was so that it was so inflexible and autocratic to the point where it stifled even cultural development. Okay? So what is the opposite of Sparta? Athens, right? Athens had extended its citizen bodies, the franchise, of course, to everyone within Attica. Anyone who was in spitting distance of the city or the region, anyone who was a man, obviously, was a citizen who could cast his vote and elect leaders, in the agora and all that kind of good stuff. And the general constitution of Athens allowed for flexibility and libertinism in the sense of personal activity, so long as it, of course, didn't imperil the city itself, and the ramifications of which caused a huge cultural flourishing. At most, at its height, Athens had like 100,000 citizens, and despite this small population, so I mean, think about it. This is like the size of a mid-sized town in the Midwest of America. This is tiny. They were able to have great philosophers like Plato, Socrates, Aristotle. To say nothing of the other great artistic events which happened as a nexus within Athens. Now, as you can see, there are cultural ramifications, human life ramifications to how we organize ourselves politically. Why is that? Well, this is a question of franchise. People have, first of all, reason to see the state and society and republic succeed if they have a buy-in, and a reason to want to see it succeed. There's a certain diminishing return of how much power a person gets vice how much they give back. And then, of course, what you do with that power, how you censor people, or how you induce people. The Greeks were great precisely because they always saw it as incumbent upon themselves to create things such as the agon, or institutions that emulated the agon, or competition. So gymnasiums, palestras, and so on, that caused great cultural flourishing and the general development of the citizen body, physically, spiritually, mentally. Rome was great, at least at first, in the Republican era, and then also the early empire, because it provided a number of outlets. It had cultural outlets, because so long as you didn't imperil the political power of the emperor, you were good to go. You could write whatever, Livy, Suetonius, Cicero. You had the right to write. You could make things, you could make art, gladiatorial games, and obviously Rome isn't as known for her genius philosophically as the Greeks were, but it was known, engineering-wise, and hard engineering, sciences, and all this kind of stuff, and the histories of Livy and so on, and of course the infinitely important aspect of how Rome served as the incubator, developer, and champion of Hellenic thought and knowledge that they reserved for themselves. So, for instance, the emperor, he used his autocracy, his power, to good use. He gave a wide latitude of action for his clients and subjects to create and to act. He gave peace. He gave a certain level of prosperity to everyone. He gave food and helped the general welfare. Moreover, he gave inducements for people to become elites and encouraged them to become excellent and to compete against each other. Where things went wrong later in the Roman Empire is when it became Christian. So it was during the Christian era that mass burnings of cultural developments, which had allied itself, versus the Christians had allied itself with the autocratic power of the emperor. The emperor, of course, censored or gave a significant amount of power to the Christian church, right? So that this power group, and the Christian church in its turn led a massive cultural death of the Roman Empire. I mean, it was just awful. That only saw its resurgence later in the 1000s to 1100. And here's the thing: is that like I said, the forms of government and what we choose to do with power have real-world effects. And the founding fathers always thought that liberty brings excellence, and surely it does. But there too also is too much liberty or libertinism can be a bad thing. And here's what I mean. So for instance, Diocletian, great Roman emperor, great dude, brought stability back to the Roman Empire, beat off a bunch of barbarians, tried to fix the economy. Obviously this was before the time of economics, so he didn't really do too good on that. But he brought a certain level of a restoration of order and discipline, and restored the auspices of the Roman Empire. Except he had originally been from the Balkans and was a descendant of a Roman legionary veteran colony. He spent his entire life away from Rome, fighting for Rome, idealizing Rome as it had been in the early Republic, a city-state defined by men and women of discipline and good character. Okay? And so he returned to Rome one day simply because he was in the area and he wanted to obviously buffer up a little bit, give some endowments, experience the triumph. And he was absolutely distraught at what he had to see in Rome. What did he see? He saw prostitution. He saw low lasciviousness. He saw, Romans debauching themselves in petty and pathetic ways. Focuses of culture had become so low and mean in the original sense that it inspired no future Livies. There were no great Cassius Dios. There were no works of literature being made or things of excellence like in the Symposia. And, I'm not saying that prudery is a good thing. But even excellence in decadence, when dedicated to Dionysus or Apollo, for instance, the Greeks at least weren't low about their cultural effusions. They always made sure that any sensuality was done so in good taste and aristocratic poise, and one that brought credit to the wider cultural consciousness. But Rome just became basically this fucking halfway house of prostitutes and idiots and weak men. And that's what happens when you have too much freedom with no direction. In other words, you basically have no balance. Discipline. The Greeks, their central axis of discipline stemmed from their want to become excellent and gain notoriety for their excellence and goodness, to be the best. But with the Romans, they had no central axle driving the cultural development of the state or the society upwards. It was just about, banging, drinking wine, freaking seeing dudes kill each other in, the gladiator arenas, seeing animals kill each other and all this kind of stuff. And there was no higher reason. There was no, discipline upwards. For the Romans, the reason why they had become excellent is because in the early Roman kingdom, when Rome was first founded, it was first an army. Remember that. It was first founded as Romulus's personal army. The legion is what Rome was first. And it was the legion that provided the discipline and the manly, stature and personal development, aiming upwards to be leaders and great men and women and so on. And what happened with the autocracy is that this became so far out of reach for most people that they abandoned those mores entirely because it didn't become necessary for them, and so there was no reason to live by a disciplined means to achieve something that was unachievable. Hence why so many patricians in the imperial era generally became Stoics, and then later Christians, because they had no hope of reaching the top, and they had no hope of controlling their future or having their will to power expressed in wider society, because the autocracy became, over time, more and more repressive and didn't allow them to spread their wings, so to say. And this is a major problem, and one which I find myself in the American Republic, is that we've made a god out of freedom, and effectively we have become slaves to our libertinism. We have ceded freedom in the sense of power, political power, and sovereignty over ourselves, and ceded them to the managerial state. And we have exacted ourselves, or hoarded to ourselves, those petty pleasures that so besought and ultimately destroyed the Roman citizen body in the late empire. And we, instead of gladiatorial games and prostitution, we spend all our focus and effort on UFC or NFL football, whatever bullshit, and OnlyFans and pornography. Everything is falling apart around us, and yet here we are, Rome cheering on as she rots in the same way. Now, that is the challenge that we have, and the balances of power and how they affect wider society. Structure matters, leadership matters, the environment matters, your agency and willfulness and ability to maneuver and make the most out of situation also matters. And so I tell you the story of Rome precisely because I can elucidate what it is that elites were looking for, and then what exactly was, the shortcomings of both systems. Because as you saw, on the one half, the late Republic was incredibly corrupt. It fell victim to the avarice, the petty avarice of the nobles, the nobility, and the optimates. And then on the other side, the autocracy, ultimately, by its dereliction of duty to engender and build up the citizen body, let the plebeians succumb to their own vices in freedom and power, and ultimately they destroyed themselves by having too much of a good thing. I understand we haven't gotten to the rivalry between Persia and Rome just yet, and the parallels between us and China just yet. I will do that in the second installment. However, I think this is a point that we'll wrap up here, and we'll do the second part later because it'll get too fucking long, and I'll get sober by the end of this transmission. Most people are material. Most people are unconscious. I mean, I don't know if you've heard this, but there's a significant portion of people who have no internal monologue. There are many who simply don't have the means or the natural excellence. As you saw with the Pareto principle, there is a stratification in terms of ability of every kind. Still further, there are very few people who have the instincts of leadership and rulership. And then fewer still within that cohort have the ability and the will to act and lead for the greater good. This tiny elite is who I'm trying to attract within here in the Legion. I'm trying to teach you everything I know, to inspire you to higher ideals, to letting you know you're part of a team, and that you can change Rome. right? Our Rome, our republic, the American Republic. And what it takes is good leadership and good institutions, good architecture and good tenants. And Rome is always going to be there as a way to show and buttress our arguments for what would be good and what would be how to check the excesses of the bad. I don't want to draw the conclusions here because it would be too long as far as what ideas I may have for the American Republic to set her straight, while still retaining, of course, her freedom, instilling her discipline, and her cause, and her self-confidence and worth. Maybe the answer lies somewhere else. Maybe in the past, maybe in the future, but I know it lies with us, here in the Legion, as it did always for Rome. It was the Legion that birthed Rome. It was the Legion who set the Republic straight to rights and raised her victorious general, Imperator, our word for emperor, which means victorious general, and raised that as the institution. And then it was, of course, the legions who protected Rome from invaders and barbarians, and it was the legions again who defended against the worst elements of Christianity and championed those best instincts within her to preserve what was left of the Roman Empire until the late date of 1453. And it was from her, of course, that birthed the leaders throughout her history, from beginning to end, even as late, of course, as Belisarius or Alexis Comnene, and so on. Okay, Legionaries, so just as a wrap-up, here's what I showed you in this transmission, right? I gave you the foundation. That is the physics of how actual power is laid out and how it works and what it is. So, what is it? Force and coercion, etc., right? The ability to force action or to induce it politically and human action. Second, I gave you three individuals who encapsulate, or four rather, encapsulate the vision of how actual power physics works. And these guys are Vilfredo Pareto, right? Interesting name. You got Michaels, of course. You have this guy, Ingenio Mosca. And then finally you have George Sorel. Each of these show, how do you say, what aspects of power there are. So, the Pareto principle. Basically, it shows that the elite is basically the best. It always controls the larger 80%. There is a stratification of ability, naturally, or wealth, naturally, or whatever. This is the 20-80 rule, of course. This is Pareto principle. And you can apply this to many things in life, naturally. Mosca talks about elite theory. He talks about the circulation of elites and the type of constitution a country has, and what that gives rise to culturally. This is what I was talking about in the late part of my transmission. I was talking to you about how autocracy and libertinism affect the general body politic and cultural production. Still further, I showed you how in Sparta versus Athens, the circulation of elites, which is to say, the induction of new individuals into the elite ruling class, helped the general body politic function. And then finally, of course, the last Moscan principle that I showed you was that as time goes on and the political environment has new features, it can induce or be the nexus of different elite ruling classes. Which is to say, remember how I told you the first elite of the Roman Republic were patricians, and then it became populist men who came from the ranks of the military, and then finally the emperors were all came from the military, like Diocletian? That's the circulation of elites in Mosca. Finally, Sorel, the myth. Remember, the myth is the meta operating system of a nation. Rome originally was a kingdom, founded by Aeneas, right? Or rather Romulus later, but whatever. Same thing. And then there was this founding myth, the refounding of Rome as a republic by the patricians, who were descended from the first families of Rome. And that itself became a myth of Rome, right? The republic itself became part of the myth, the constitution, and it limited the actions of its constituent bodies and political elites. It was no accident that Caesar was assassinated. It wasn't simple political intrigue and resentment that killed him. But the reason why we remember Caesar for having been assassinated was precisely because Brutus was acting out on the myth of the republic, killing the tyrant. And it's precisely because of this that Augustus was wise enough to duck and reform the myth, or at least work from the myth to make the forms that he needed, which is to say, he didn't break from it. He moved with it and then made it into something else. So that is what is called the popular myth, right? So all those principles I've showed you how they interact within a state. I show you how the body politic reflects the general balances of power within Rome, okay? And then I show you, of course, if you apply those paradigms to the United States, and you track, of course, the development of the United States over time in 250 years, how it came from an agrarian society to a dichotomy between the industrialized North and the heavily latifundia South. Later, of course, the 1920s and 1960s period of the heavy middle class, until finally where we are now, which is the late Republic, again, where elites rule, a rapacious elite, like in the late Roman Republic, and the local Americans are cast to the wayside. And, of course, you could probably apply your knowledge in the change of how the actual evolution of political power in America changed, right? From the early confederation of individual states in a United States polity federation into a more centralized and bureaucratized, I don't know how to pronounce that, goddamn. I'm getting sober. Anyway, centralized government, and it's becoming increasingly so. And then, of course, the disparity in wealth, where it started, where, of course, there were wealthy men, but the disparity between rich and poor wasn't very great, and the means of wealth and power weren't very great in distance. And then as time went on, of course, that stratification increased and concentrated into an elite. And, of course, it's becoming more and more difficult to become part of the ruling caste, especially since World War II. Many of the avenues feeding into the elite are becoming shut off for every American. How do you negotiate that? Well, let's indicate to the Roman past. And perhaps maybe that's something that you yourself may ruminate on, and maybe why it indicates I love this legion and want to raise an American citizen body that will restore a republic, maybe under a new form. But this is why we're here, to help our peers and subordinates, to honor our ancestors, but also to provide for our progeny. Not simply to be sufficient, but to be great. To make America part of the destiny of colonizing the stars and exploring the universe. We can only do that if we're excellent, and excellence is only apparent in environments which provide for it. And that's the only way you can do that is, of course, how we balance our politics, how we balance our reward system, our incentives, the structure of environment, as well as the individual capacity of the individual to be agent and to strive for excellence and competition and imbibe some of that Greek spirit of the agon and excellence and so on and so forth. And so take this, read the books. I'm going to, instead of reading all the books those individuals wrote, I'll provide you one that will surmise all the ones that I talked about. And there's this great book by James Burnham called The Machiavellians and the Protectors of Freedom or whatever. Forget about freedom and his whole thing. Forget about that. Just skip over those chapters. He gives an excellent summary of each of these thinkers and how they interact with one another and how politics is. Completely devoid from moral, interpretation and warping of reality. You can't let morals warp your reality. Morals are ends, not means. And at the end of the day, too much reality is lost to fantasies we have. Okay? So read that. I'll provide the URL below. And we'll continue on. And next episode, we'll talk about Rome squaring off with Persia. And in that episode, we'll talk about the implications within Rome and then also without. But without further ado, this is Politeia, Lance's Legion, Sergeant Barnes. We're getting sober. Signing off.